wisdom will fall out of any one of us any time.
Right. Well,
Good luck with that.
so we're on. He's going into
I don't
the
know what happened
cloud.
to Mary Ann. I don't know if she
Maybe she'll try again to
try
join us.
again. And so sometimes works and sometimes doesn't with her.
Yeah.
All right. So when we last left off our friends in Israel, which is still all Israel, just one kingdom, Solomon had consolidated his power, right?
Mhm.
The good old-fashioned way, and I guess sort of making the good old-fashioned way, but so it's consolidated his power. So I think we can work through all the way from chapter 3 to 8 today, because only in 3 and 4 is there a lot of things happening. 5 and 6 and most of 7 are pretty much given over to lists. First lists of his officials, and then lists of all the things he's going to build and put in the temple or in his palace. All right. And Solomon builds one heck of a temple. He really does. I have a little YouTube video of 3.5 minutes of one of those 3D like reconstructions going through the temple and everything. It's kind of cool. I also think it's kind of funny that, you know, it took him 11 and a half years and a whole lot of money to build the temple, but it took him 13 years to build his house. You know, just like he's not giving himself, you know, he's not giving himself short shrift in the end. You know. Let's see here. There's someone in the waiting room. Admit.
I got it.
You got it? Okay. All right. Excellent. So I'm going to see if this works here. Try to share screen. And let's see. Safari. Share. And then. Will that work?
Yeah. I see it.
Seems to.
That's amazing, operator. All right. Well, actually, first of all, I thought it'd be fun to look at a map and see where we're talking about. All right. A lot of you all are pretty familiar with this and how it would look at the time anyway. But this, as I understand it, would have been the farthest extent of the territorial gains of the Israeli kingdom. So David, and the end of David and all of Solomon would have held most all of this. And then it would start shrinking basically pretty fast after that, once Israel here and Judah become two separate kingdoms. But, all right, so Edom and Moab, and of course the Philistines down in Philistia, all right, they get a whole lot of press, right? Those people pop up all the time, from the Pentateuch right up till now. The Moabites especially are always being a big pain in the butt, right? Up here in Phoenicia, though, we're going to see in a second when Solomon starts making a bunch of basically trade deals, right, with various kings. He makes a lot of them with the king of Tyre. And his people, you see Sidon or Sidon, like right above Tyre there. So it refers to the king of Tyre, but it refers to his people as the Sidonians. So there must have been like the whole Phoenicia territory there that he was actually had control of. So Solomon's going to get all his lumber basically from up there in Phoenicia, right, and trade food, you know, wheat basically, or barley or whatever it is they grew for them up there. And that's a deal that goes on for years. All right. So up in Damascus, modern Syria, right?
Yeah.
All right. That's going to be a hotbed of rebellion eventually, right? And same way down south. All right. But let's see here. So modern Israel is, well, in Israel, where we see it here, right? And let's see, what would be modern Jordan? Would that be Philistia? No. It would be,
yeah, Ammon, Moab,
on the other side.
probably down to Edom.
Right.
On the other side of the Jordan River, the running north and
Right.
south.
So there you got Jericho, you got Bethlehem, you got Hebron, you got all the things you hear about a lot. And then eventually when the kingdom spread apart there, you got Samaria. I guess I give it a star because that'll be the capital of the northern kingdom. Eventually, I think they try a couple other ones first. And Jerusalem, which is pretty near the border, isn't it? It'll be the capital of Judah. And I guess they have separate little castle designations for other kingly cities, or maybe temples. I bet that's probably temples, because I think there was a worship spot in Bethel that was pretty important.
Right. Yeah.
So
Bethel and Shiloh and Shechem all had worship spaces.
Yeah, that's right. And I see one way up in Dan, so that must have been the for the north there. All right, so
Dan is very interesting because we don't even know that may have been a Yahwistic temple. It may have been a heathen or a pagan temple of some kind. One of the things that always strikes me as interesting when you look at these maps is that there are a lot of Mediterranean ports to this territory, and yet neither Solomon's kingdom nor Judah, after the breakup of the two kingdoms, had much control over any of the seaports. The northern one, as you said, were in Phoenicia, which may have been friendly with Solomon, but certainly was never under his control. And then there's some debate about whether the Philistia area actually came under Solomon's control during this period or not. But if it's so, it didn't last very long.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it gives you like seeing some names that we not only recognize from the Bible, but recognize as places you could fly into today. You know, I always just blown away by the age of places outside of America. I've never spent one day outside of America in my life, and I'm 42 years old. So, like, I look at places around the world, I'm like, darn, things have been around for a long time. You dig?
As a American traveling in places like this, that was one of the things that just I felt almost viscerally. Just that,
well, Jericho is probably at least 9,000 years old.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jericho is it's in the Pentateuch, right? Because they refer to they refer to Jericho. Moses refers to Jericho, doesn't he? I think in the Pentateuch. I know it's in Joshua, but I think it's before that as well. Yeah, good stuff. So let me go to Genesis 3 here.
Yeah, I mean, it's the walls of Jericho come tumbling down as they enter from the. So yeah.
Yes, indeed.
It's in the Pentateuch.
It always encouraged me to play the trumpet. Yeah. I played the trumpet for a few years, then went to clarinet, then went back to trumpet. Made all the way to freshman year of high school, pretty much just faking my way through. Got to go to Disney World behind it.
Oh.
All right, so Solomon asks for wisdom as we begin 1 Kings 3. And I like this section a whole lot. Because a couple reasons I'll get to at the end, but I like the way God comes to him, right? Instead of like showing up to the stranger and knocking on the door. So Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. Once again, Solomon's continuing being a modern political king, right? Now instead of getting rid of people, he's making deals. Right? This is what you do. You marry their daughters and give your daughters in marriage. So he brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord. That's going to take a while. And the wall. The people, however, I love this part. This is interesting. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given to him by his father David. Except they offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. I don't have any note about that, but I assume that these same high places had been used by the Canaanites in sacrifice to, well, their various gods. And so it was, the Lord being a jealous God did not want those same ones used for him, I imagine. Pastor Monty, you have anything to say about that? Because it seems like it's discouraged, but apparently it was done.
Yeah, no, I think you kind of put your finger on it. I mean, that there are these kind of competing religious institutions and traditions, some of which would get called into question, especially during the exile, when they kind of come back and say, our attention was divided. We worship too much in other ways. It's a kind of a constant tension, and yeah, there's a real purity movement following the exile.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Richard wants to comment on that either, but too.
Richard?
I think one of the things that strikes me in reading this entire um, epic from Joshua through the end of Kings and Chronicles is kind of a commentary on that same period,
Right.
is that the idolatry as defined by the worship of a pagan, uh, what should we say, a pagan religious culture never seems to be completely overcome. It's one of the things that the prophets are continually preaching against. And it's obvious that many of the kings, certainly including David and Solomon, included all of these different kinds of pagan worship in some cases, inside the temple. And so it's a constant struggle to try to define the Yahwistic religion as opposed to all of these other leftovers of earlier cultures or neighboring cultures.
Mm-hmm. And last Sunday, we were looking at the story from Genesis 22, the near sacrifice of Isaac, and some of the more recent scholarship is drawing a contrast there. That the point being made, according to these scholars, is that child sacrifice is not a thing God chooses, or not a thing that pleases God. Whereas it's a common occurrence in cultures in this region at the time, in the time of Abraham and Sarah. So that's, it's a kind of a constant theme throughout the Hebrew Bible, this tension.
Yeah, it seems that whenever the impression I get is in the Old Testament is that whenever other religions are referred to as detestable, or the gods as detestable, the number one reason, with sexual immorality being a close number two, the number one reason is child sacrifice. I also find it interesting that, that the pagans worshipped in the quote unquote the high places, the hills, or it wasn't, whatever they can get, the high places, and encountering God in the Old Testament often takes place also in high places, right? Mm-hmm. You go to the mountaintop. Moses always going to the mountaintop, right, to talk to God. That's where everyone, they're up there, so you get close as you can, get as high as you can. All right, so in just one second here. You guys still seeing the screen or no?
Yeah, I was seeing the map.
We're seeing the map still.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so you're still on the map. I went back to this, but it didn't work. There we go. All right, so in verse 4, the king, Solomon, he goes to Gibeon and offers sacrifices, for that was another important high place. Obviously, these are established places, whether they're supposed to be or not. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. Not bad. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, which I love. And God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. And so this is the wisest thing I think Solomon does. I think asking for wisdom is the wisest thing he does. Solomon answered, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You've continued this great kindness to him, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child, metaphorically, he's like 40, and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart. Very Jesuit language. Discernment is always the word thrown around this house. To govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? And the Lord was pleased that Solomon asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor if you ask for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never be anyone like you. So there has never been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you all these things you didn't ask for, as a bonus, because you asked for wisdom. And if you walk in obedience to me and decrees and commands as David your father did, keeping the covenant, you're half of it, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream, but he also realized he had talked to God. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. So, like I was saying, I think the wisest thing Solomon does is ask for wisdom. Right? And then immediately you get his greatest hit. Basically, like reading through the rest of First Kings, the rest of the examples of Solomon's wisdom is given in his knowledge or his theory about natural history, philosophy maybe. But here's like the only like concrete example I see of discernment and judgment among the people, right? And this is probably the most famous part of First Kings. Now, 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, pardon me, my lord, the woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, the woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one else in the house but the 2 of us. It's a small brothel. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. Okay, let's skip over that for a second. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from her side while I, your servant, was sleeping. She put him by her breast and put the dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. When I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. The other woman said, no, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours. The first one insisted, no, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine, and so forth. They argued before the king. The king, Solomon, summarizes, you say this, you say that. How am I to know? The king says, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. He gave an order, cut the living child in 2 and give half to the one and half to the other. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son. Said the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. The other one says, neither you or I shall have him. Cut him in 2. Then the king gave his ruling. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they had held the king in awe, because they saw he had wisdom from God to administer justice. A couple of like flippant points. One, these must have been some really heavy sleepers, both of them. And 2, one thing that might kind of suck about being the king is it's your responsibility to hear this kind of stuff. If I were Solomon, I'd be like, don't I have administrators? Don't I have other magistrates? I was reading an NIV anyway, text note that said that everyone has the right to appeal to the king. Wouldn't everyone appeal to the king all the time then? Like, if you had that right, why would you ever settle for the judgment of a magistrate? So he must have spent a whole lot of his time having to do stuff like this. Right? And the question I want to throw out to y'all is, this is always given as an example of Solomon's wisdom. How would you describe that wisdom? In other words, how is he actually displaying wisdom here? What about this ruling is wise?
He understands human psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he seems to, instead of using just logic, because I think we all take it for granted that the result was what he expected, that he never was going to follow through on cutting a kid in half. Right? So he's counting on compassion.
Yeah. Well, he's sagacious or savvy or, sage.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, deeply aware of like, yeah, the good and the bad in human behavior.
And he can prove it. That everyone could see that by the reactions of the two people. He could have just said, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, you, I'm the king." All right.
Right.
But
Or I'll take it for myself.
Right, exactly. As building a temple, he has no problems borrowing people. So yeah, he could have. But again, I think you're right. I think that he's counting on he's using psychology. He's counting on human reactions rather than just trying to use logic, right? And I think that's the primary example of his wisdom. Anybody else have any insights or questions or jokes about Solomon's wise ruling?
I would just want to point out one thing, that this is a perfect example of how what I call short stories get incorporated into the epic, Hebrew epic. I don't know that there's an exact parallel, but I think we can find very comparable stories in earlier Egyptian literature and certainly in Babylonian literature. So this is a story that probably originated somewhere else and got translated into the story about Solomon because it represented what a later idea when this book was written of what a wise ruler should be. And so it says probably, I think, more about the person who compiled the book than the real story about Solomon. I suspect it is not historically true.
It's possible that it's what's that word for a story that isn't literally true, but is a example of a point.
There's different kinds of truth, and this is probably one of those examples of something that is true at a level probably deeper or more extensive than historical truth.
Mm-hmm. And I find it interesting that I think you're right, it might have sprung from a source outside of Israel, one of those surrounding, territories.
Yeah.
Solomon was one of the kings whose fame, whose reputation spread outside of his own borders. All right. So someone could have been.
It's also a story that, this still happens where people lay on their babies and they die. There's enough of that kind of truth in it. It connects to us today. It's a common tragic experience.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you also have a lot of lawsuits over issues that are very similar to that. Who's the real father? Who's the real mother, and not in a biological sense, but in in a more nurturing sense.
Yeah. That's why the casualness of prostitution as a occupation is interesting to me too. Like there's no condemnation of them for what they do. Now, of course, it might have been. There seems to be in the Old Testament anyway a designation between prostitution for tourist trade and temple prostitutes, right? Or something that is in service to a foreign god. Yeah. And that seems to come in for much more condemnation. But, the brothel inside the gate, seems to be. Yeah.
It's interesting that they both felt they had legal standing to go and argue in front of the king. Mm-hmm. That reflects something different than today, where you people you don't just go work it out amongst yourselves, or I'll throw you both in jail.
Indeed, especially because there's the NIV text that notes they may not have been Israelite, they may have been Jebusite, which I believe are the people that give Jerusalem its name. But again, they have the right to go to the king, and boy, he must have had to do a whole lot of that. All right, let me go to Kings 4 real quick here. 1 second, I think my wife needs something, so she's trying to sneak into the room.
It's okay.
All right.
Hello, Katie.
Oh, by the way, handyman at 6:00.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
All right. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Sometimes you also have to point out that the handyman's coming to fix the toilet.
I just said
Four. I have to go like stop that, and then I have to go like that, and then I have to go like that, and then I have to go like that. Sweet. That work? Yay. All right. Seems to have worked. All right. So the first part of 1 Kings 4 is just a list. It's basically he filled out his cabinet. All right. He's got to appoint governors in all the different locations. And there's not much there unless you really like the name Jehoshaphat. You'll notice that there's 2 different Jehoshaphat's. It must have been the Bob of his time. And you'll see that, the people that were loyal through a couple of those early uprisings, they get rewarded. So Zabud, son of Nathan, remember the prophet Nathan, the one who came into King David and said, hey, you know what's going on? So his kid is a priest and advisor to the king. Right?
Ben-Hur's a real person.
Oh, there's lots of Ben-Hurs.
Oh.
Ben is a prefix. This means son of.
Yeah.
So basically, there's a lot of Bens. And there's another Ben-Hur earlier. I think it was a Ben-Hur later, too. So lots of Bens in there. There's your second Jehoshaphat, the son of Pharaoh. He's the leader of Issachar, the governor of Issachar there. And then it goes into what Solomon gets a day from all of his subjects. All right. I think, and I'm just going to zoom through this, but I think each is responsible for providing for the palace for a month each, right? There's 12 tribes, they get a month each. I haven't looked through this in there somewhere. But they have to give them a lot. Quotas of barley, straw, all sorts of things. Back down to Solomon's wisdom. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight in verse 29 here, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. The Bible really loves using sand on the seashore metaphors. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all you can tell it's a desert, of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. And I love it gets specific about who he was wiser than. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite. If I was Ethan the Ezrahite, I'd be like, what gives? What did I do? I get specifically named as being dumber. So Ethan the Ezrahite, he was wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda. He was wiser than the sons of Mahol, and his fame spread to all of the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. So he was more prolific than Burt Bacharach. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish, and from all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world, and who had heard of his wisdom. So I think it's funny that I have a feeling, I don't know this, and I don't see any text notes on it, but maybe the prophets who were compiling this, whoever compiled that section, maybe those people were contemporaries of his own, who he wasn't particularly fond of. And like, these people think they're so smart. Well, the Solomon was a lot smarter than them. Other than that, I know nothing about who Ethan the Ezrahite was.
I don't think anybody does.
So take that, Ethan. Also, I read that last section about basically about knowing a lot about natural history, or what they would call natural philosophy up until the 19th century. And you know what springs to my mind? Thomas Jefferson, right? He sounds like the Thomas Jefferson of his day. Right? I'm a big American history guy. It's my full-time gig, and Jefferson's always been one of my favorites. Right? I'm certainly not unique in that. but not just because he was a fairly significant president and author of the Declaration of Independence, of course, and the Statutes of Rights of Religious Freedom in Virginia and all various other things, but because he wrote down the weather every day of his life. And when he sent Lewis and Clark out, he was most excited about getting physical samples back, so he could run experiments. He was interested in everything. He was
polyglot.
Yeah, he was, and so that reminds me, like, Solomon seemed to be the kind of guy who was interested in everything, right? And he had the time, and he had the patience, and he had the wisdom. He'd been given the wisdom to look into all these things. And like Jefferson, he wasn't above slave labor. A little bit, but no, Monty didn't like that joke.
Yeah. Well, and tomorrow night you can watch Hamilton on Disney Plus if you have that. Jefferson doesn't come off quite as well.
Well, I play the Hamilton Jefferson rap battles to my classes when we discuss certain topics.
I bet they could stand up and actually do it. Yeah,
they can. I have a couple of kids who are way into it. Yeah. Very good. But being free of presentism for a second, I think Jefferson was sort of a, as progressive as someone in his position could have been at that particular time. I think Solomon exhibits a lot of these characteristics of being a Renaissance man, 1,000 years before the Renaissance, a couple thousand years before the Renaissance. And I think that's kind of cool. I also think that if any of that natural history and philosophy had been written down, we might have found that it was not particularly accurate. Just guessing that he probably didn't really know animal anatomy and husbandry perhaps as well as we would now, but who knows? All right. One more. Okay. 1 second as I try to do that again. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves for a second.
Well, I want to know if you've read the Hemmings of Monticello, because that really opened my eyes to what a jerk Jefferson was, unless you think it was all made up, but it's well documented.
I don't think it's made up. I don't think it's entirely a non-consensual relationship. But
but it's not just that, It's not just that.
But I don't believe he freed Sally Hemings upon his death. He freed some of her brothers, I think.
He freed his own
Sally herself.
He freed his own children with her upon reaching a certain age. Some of them he actually sent north to try to pass, along with financial resources to do so. Others he didn't. But there was, and it probably wasn't just Sally Hemings too. There's I read a couple of biographies of Jefferson that take note that during his time, various people who would visit Monticello and the grounds would note in their own diaries and correspondence how quote unquote white his slaves were, like notably whiter than most slaves in the neighborhood and the surrounding areas. Mm-hmm. So whether that's all Jefferson, his brother, his brother-in-law,
his father-in-law,
his father-in-law, and the overseers, how much of that is progenically or genetically Jefferson himself, there was nonetheless, it was commented upon at the time, that his slaves were notably, quote unquote, whiter. So there is that.
Yeah. Well, I remember visiting Monticello, and just the house itself is remarkable with all the little details of the innovations that Jefferson built into that house.
I visited when I was 12, and I remember to this day being impressed that he invented the automatic door. Remember that with the.
That was one of my childhood activities of self-entertainment. I would draw layouts for houses, usually partially underground. But,
Really?
Yeah, that's a whole different story. But I really did appreciate what. Yeah, so he was quite a remarkable person for sure.
Yeah,
complicated.
It was, and those, like, in this day and age, and for probably forever now, the founding fathers are going to become more and more controversial. Right?
Yeah.
As we examine their personal lives. Jefferson's views of slavery, he writes about slavery. He doesn't usually write about it favorably. Yeah, he was a very large slaveholder. And, well, I mean, as were what, 4 of our first 5 presidents? Is that right? Washington.
Well, we had a total, I believe, of 9 presidents who owned at least one slave.
Yeah. Washington was the biggest slaveholder. Washington, in terms of even adjusted for it and putting their money into our money's terms, Washington is the second richest president we ever had.
Right.
Would have been the first richest president were it not for the Donald.
Well, we don't know for sure about the Donald. Do we?
Yeah, right.
I'll make you taking it.
That's true.
But the one thing I believe Washington did was I think he freed all of his slaves upon death.
I don't know.
I think that's correct, Ken. In looking at somebody like Jefferson, I think there are so many different levels at which we approach. We can do it. We can talk about the issues of slavery. We can talk about his wealth. At one level, we can talk about his inventions and his knowledge of natural history. I think, from my perspective as a historian of the 19th century, I think the most important thing about Jefferson is that the tone he set for politics in his time, because there is a major shift from Washington and Adams and the Federalists to Jefferson and Jeffersonian democracy and the development of what was then called the Republican Party. A huge shift in American culture, in American politics, and American society as a whole. And so I think, again, Jefferson is, I think, one of the most pivotal figures. I would put him alongside Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. And probably Franklin Roosevelt, but I'm still uncertain about that.
As far as democratizing the country, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that someone who might even be more important than that as far as bringing everyone or more people into the political process is someone who's probably even more controversial, and that's Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, he's still on the 20. I don't know. Remember, it was like 4, 5, 6 years ago, Andrew Jackson was going to be replaced by Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman, yeah.
Harriet Tubman, yeah. Kevin,
there.
we can talk about Jackson sometime. I do not feel that he was a very significant figure in American society.
Oh, really?
I think the real figure that we need to look at, who was totally ignored by the history books, was Charles Finney, the great revivalist, because while Jackson may have had hundreds of followers, Finney literally had millions. And what we call Jacksonian democracy was really the work of evangelical revivalists.
I really don't know much about the Second Great Awakening, to be honest with you. Or that would be the First Great Awakening. No, second. No.
Yeah, the Second Great Awakening is kind of coterminous with what we call Jacksonian democracy, 1830s, 1840s, into the 1850s.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Segue back into First Kings, the temple is, pardon me, very grand, very grand, but God, God didn't want this thing to begin with.
Well, I think the significance again of Solomon is that he does set a tone for what a king ought to be and what a society should be. There are some bumps and freckles and warts and all of that, but nonetheless, I think he more than David, I think, becomes the standard. David is significant because of he is the one that the promise of the eternal anointed kingdom or anointed king will be based upon. But Solomon is the gold standard, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that right here in 5, I'm not going to read it. It's a third example of his early modern kingship. First, you have the elimination of close enemies, or possible enemies. Then you have intermarriage, and now you have trade deals. All right. So with Hiram here, the king of Tyre, the Sidonians, he's going to get all that good Lebanese cedar, right? And some pine too, I think, thrown in for a lot of food. And this goes on for years. You got the cedar and the juniper in exchange for food. And then 13, King Solomon, he conscripts laborers from all over Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in ships of 10,000 a month. So they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. And what are they doing in Lebanon? They're chopping down trees and they're floating them down. All right, takes a lot of wood. Then he has Adoniram, that's the guy he put in charge of the forced laborers. It's not like they're not using the word slaves, all right? And I guess they're not full-time slaves. Right? It's kind of like service, a mandatory 1 month per year service to your country and your king. Right? But it's obviously not a voluntary force either. You don't use the word conscription and forced labor when you're talking about volunteerism. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills. And he had 3,300 foremen who supervised the projects. So they're taking all that large blocks of high grade stone and all those trees, and they're going to build the temple and the palace as well. Right? And the craftsmen of Solomon and they're laying the foundation, literally. All right. I have a couple minutes left. I want to show that 3D image of the temple. The chapter 6 and 7. Let me stop this real quick. Okay, so chapter 6 and 7 is nothing basically but lists of the construction and the furnishings of the temple and of the palace. The palace doesn't get to, the palace's physical dimensions aren't described in as great detail as far as like the layout goes. But there are other palaces that have survived archaeologically and figure it out about what it would look like. The temple, of course, furnishings are described in great detail and basically are what Moses had said they should be, back in Leviticus. So take a look at this. See if I can get it to work. All right, up there. Screen again. This time I go up that. Share. All right. All right, everyone see that?
Yeah.
All right, cool. I'm just going to let this play through. It's just 3 minutes or so. And this is be as much of a tour of Solomon's temple as we're ever going to get. stop right there because you can actually like see the layout for a second. And I assume it's like the outer courtyard where the trees are, right in there.
Cool.
That was nice.
Yeah.
So obviously it's not as nice as Immanuel, but it does have a lot more gold.
I'm surprised by those Egyptian-looking things with the, the Egyptian-looking hairdo or head, whatever. And yeah, was that a direct influence from Egypt?
I don't know.
I think it's an interesting little video, and I think it's very well done, except I think it's fake. I would doubt very much that there were any winged lions or anything like that in the Holy of Holies. Very likely what was inside the inner sanctuary was simply the Ark of the Covenant and an altar. The menorah are totally anachronistic. They do not show up in Jewish history until probably the 2nd or 3rd century. So a little bit of fakery, I'm afraid, in this film.
What about that? No, it seems like the menorah are described by Moses as the candle stands.
A candlestick, yeah, but the menorah itself, as the 7-branch candlestick, is a much later development, and probably from either the late Persian or even the early Greek period.
All right then. I need of authenticity. I just like to show fun videos.
Yeah, it was.
Was a fun video.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, some of the parts of it I think are very accurate from what we know, but like I say, I think it actually seems to me that it looks a little bit more like the Second Temple, the one that was built in the 1st century. So I think maybe somebody has gotten their wires crossed a little bit.
Perhaps. I tried to find one with Solomon's palace, and I couldn't find anything. Although I found lots of pictures of archaeological digs. It's not as much.
Yeah,
fun.
I don't think we have any, any even decent remains of Solomon's palace.
No, there's all I could find was a lot of speculation as to where it was. And if you're speculating about where it was, you obviously don't have much to show.
3,000 years ago. So.
Yeah. Well, that's no excuse.
Let me just say, excuse me that I have to leave early, but I'm enjoying it immensely.
Oh, no worries. I actually have to get going now, too. It's about 7 till.
We have Kevin again next week, and then we don't have anybody scheduled after that. So it's a question about whether we take our normal summer break in the middle of July and go or not.
Well, as long as Kevin wants to keep running, I'm ready to follow him.
Yeah,
Us too.
I'm having fun, so we'll do it next week. But I don't see any reason why we shouldn't get through at least First Kings. And,
yeah. Okay.
So let's keep it going.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very
so
good.
much.
Have a great week.
All right.
Good week.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right.